Hi there. This short video is going to give you some background on Deuteronomic history that's going to be important for your understanding as we move into covering the historical books in the Old Testament. So we talked about 4 different groups of writers that put together those first 5 books in the Bible. The J writers or Yahwist writers, the E writers or Elohist writers, the D or Deuteronomic writers, and the P or priestly writers. The D writers in Torah, in those first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, emphasized the law. And these writers also put together some of the historical books that are in the Old Testament. So the writers of Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel are called the Deuteronomic writers, the Deuteronomic historians. And they're called that because their theology that kind of shows in all of these different books is that Israel has problems when they don't follow the law. Things go well for Israel when they do follow the law. And the events that these books talk about happened about 3,000 years ago, but the books were finalized quite a bit later than that. Probably the most important thing to remember when we're looking at these historical books in the Old Testament is that the ancient understanding of history was different than our current understanding of history. So, for example, if you today opened a history textbook, you expect that everything that's in that textbook is factually accurate. That's not necessarily the case in the Old Testament. Ancient history was really all about getting the message across. And so you would combine all sorts of different traditions. So you would use different literary styles, and you would shift some facts if you needed to, if that's what really helped your message to get through. So the message was more important than having everything exactly factually accurate. Now, if you could get your message across and maintain factual accuracy, then you're going to do that because that's easier. There's less work to do. But ancient understanding of history is a little different than our current understanding. So that's just important to remember as we start to look at this section of the Bible. And so at the beginning of the historical books, so at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, we leave the Hebrews in the desert right at the edge of the promised land. And the historical books is when the Hebrews move into Canaan, move into the promised land. And one of the things that we find that when they get into Canaan, there are already people living there. And so, it wasn't just empty waiting for them to move right in. But what we see is that territory was not united. There were lots of different cities, but those cities were self-governed. Each city just did its own thing. There was no standing army in any of those cities, and there were few alliances between cities. So stop for a moment and kind of ask yourself, so self-governed cities, so they're not working together, so there are few alliances, and they don't have an army. Would those things make it easier to take over all these different cities or harder to take over these different cities? Easier, right? And that's exactly what the Hebrews find. Now, the one thing that these kind of people in these different cities do have in common is that they had a common kind of fertility religion, so related to your crops. You would pray for good crops, pray for, healthy children. But there were lots of different ways that happened, varied practice into how that actually happened. So that's a little bit of background on the Deuteronomic historians, and I look forward to looking at some of their work with you in class.